So, we have our next speaker up here today. If we could just bring the room to a nice gentle silence. Nice, way to go. Good listening crowd. Okay, so next up we have Dan Greig. Dan here is a student of cognitive science and philosophy here at U of T. He's a community organizer here for a variety of groups, including the CSSDP, so Dan is actually one of the leading figures to bring you this event today. He hosts a seminar series here called the Psychedelic State. He's spoken at a number of conferences here in Toronto. Having gotten to know Dan over the last couple months, I can say with a sure heart that he is a rising star in the field of cognitive science and psychedelic studies. So we're honored to have you here today, Dan, and take it away.
Thank you so much. Okay, so like Bruce said, I am a student here at the University of Toronto. I'm still doing my undergrad, but I'm a very excited undergrad, so people usually think I'm doing graduate studies, but that's not the case. This is what I hope to be doing soon, and why I'm building a lot of this theoretical work, so that I can do that effectively very soon. So what I'm going to be talking about today are the variety of insightful experiences. And I just want to check, can everybody hear me okay at the back? Excellent. So the title, of course, being Tip of the Hat to William James' key work on the variety of religious experience. And what I'm going to be doing is relating insight to the religious experience and relate how the tendency for psychedelic compounds to produce mystical experiences, feelings of transcendent oneness and bliss and unity and so on, how those are functionally related to why microdosing might be effective. And then we'll talk a little bit about that. I'll give you a breakdown of my argument here. Cool. So yeah, so this is the general roadmap. We're going to consider what insightful experience is. We're going to look at the everyday experience of insight, which is the aha moment that all of you are probably familiar with when you are stuck on some problem, or you don't even know there's a problem, and you come to say, aha, I now have this solution all at once, and I thought that was difficult, but it's actually not. We're then going to talk about mystical experiences. We're going to talk specifically about the psychedelic state. What I'm referring to is the insight circuit, which is kind of like a destabilization network that happens in both insight and the mystical experience, and then the consequences for psychedelic therapy and microdosing given that information. This is what I have sort of roughly outlined as being the variety of insightful experience. There's a boundary here because these first three items, implicit learning, perception, and the attentional pathways, we've talked about flow experiences, insight, and the unitive mystical experience. I also talked about creativity a little bit, but not enough to add an arrow, I thought. So let's talk about the neural correlates of the psychedelic state. So one of the things they do is they reduce the integrity of higher order functional connectivity networks, as I mentioned, in a dose-dependent manner. Properties of human cognition and how that is happening is functionally related between those four experiences below. And so we're going to specifically talk today about insight and the unitive mystical experience, but we'll touch on almost all of these domains as we go. All right, so here's very broadly a definition of insightful experience. So as I've mentioned in passing, it's a cluster of functionally related experiences. They are adaptive, enabling optimal or peak experiences. They change how one sees the world and how one acts in the world. Now what's important to notice about this is that there's no necessarily normative basis by which insightful experience occurs. You can have false insights, you can have mystical experiences that give you delusions of grandeur, coming to think that you are Christ, and other sorts of things that are arguably maladaptive. So it's important to, I think, lay that out, because microdosing and other things can sort of trigger the insight circuit without there being really any content for that to be triggered by. And yeah, it's just important for sort of teasing out what exactly is happening. So psychedelics and problem solving are very much related, and I think many people do approach them with this attitude. The Santo Daime Church explicitly refers to ayahuasca, which contains the tryptamine DMT, as a key technology that unlocks solutions to psychophysical and existential problems. And of course, that is precisely what makes this useful for therapy. We all have problems about how to live and how to be in the world, and that's why we undergo therapy and why the psychedelic-assisted therapy might be useful. And interestingly, it is the occurrence of a mystical experience that's the most predictive of lasting therapeutic outcomes from psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy, sort of getting at the fact that what could be important here is that capacity to facilitate and enhance one's capacity for insight into their situation. So as the mystical experience involves the same neurocognitive processes that allow for insight problem solving, which is a body of literature we will talk about in a moment, but to a much greater magnitude, these things are very much the same. The mystical experience is kind of like an extended moment of aha. And given that psychedelic compounds can produce these mystical experiences, I'm arguing that the mechanisms by which psychedelics produce mystical experiences are precisely those that produce insightful experience in general. All right, so insight. I do a quick Google search. This is the immediate definition that you'll find. It's the capacity to gain an accurate and deep intuitive understanding, a deep understanding of a person or a thing. And then there's this interesting definition that is being pulled from something in psychiatry saying that it's a new understanding by a mentally ill person of the cause of their disorder. So interestingly, you get these two poles. One where insight is like necessarily objectively true in some sense, at least according to our common definitions, and something where insight sort of is necessarily a part of a pathology. And that's not really an accident. As I've mentioned, the insight circuit can sort of misfire and become miscoordinated. And so what is very important is sort of optimally attuning this aspect of our experience. Now within the insight problem-solving literature, they take a bit more of a sort of minimal stance on it, and they specifically study the aha moment. So that's the moment where you're solving a problem, you get stuck at it, and you have to sort of change how you see things in order to access the solution. And so this is, I think, a very accessible definition of this, which comes from a book called The Eureka Factor. It's a very good, concise summary of a lot of this research. It's only about 200 pages long, definitely a recommended read. So the authors define this as the sudden experience of comprehending something that you didn't understand before, thinking about a familiar thing in a novel way, or combining familiar things to form something new. So it's about reconstrual, reformulation, a change of how you're relating the elements of your perception. So I'll show you an example of a classic insight problem. This is the 9-dot problem. You will inevitably see this later again today. When I can tell many of you are expecting that. So this is actually a very difficult problem. Nobody can solve this. The solution rate for this in experimental context is 0. One of the reasons for that is that there are ways in which our perceptual and cognitive systems construe the information on this page that sort of inhibit our capacity to solve it. So if you're looking at this, you probably think, well, there's a bunch of dots. This looks like a connected dot problem. That's how I'm going to approach this. The instructions that people are given for this is that with 4 lines, you have to connect all of the dots without taking your pen off the page. So many people do indeed formulate this as a connected dot problem and try to solve it, and you can't actually solve it in that way. So people get very frustrated, spend a lot of time on this, and typically nobody figures out that this is the solution. You actually have to make, in this solution, at least 2 non-dot turns. And when you show this to people, they don't get really happy about it. It sort of seems as though you're violating some rules. So it violates the expectations that we're making in this initial framing of the problem. But of course, the experimenters never tell you that you have to only turn on the dot. That's just an initial problem formulation problem. So sometimes the way that we are immediately construing situations in our lives is preventing us from seeing the elements of the problem space that allows us to adaptively interact with it. So you can't act in a way that affords the solution to this problem unless you see this problem in a particular kind of way, and it's our problem formulation that prevents this from happening. So this is a Necker cube. In the research on insight problem solving, this is often referred to as like a prototype for the insight experience. If you look at this, you'll notice that there are 2 different aspects which can be seen as the front, and if you stare at it, you'll sort of switch between them. So that is something like what's going on in insight. There's nothing really any different there, but how you are construing the information changes and shifts. And interestingly, this and also the problem reformulation that we see in insight problems in general is neurally represented in that there is a particular network state that is involved in maintaining a perception, and shifting between these two different ways of seeing this object actually uses the same sorts of mechanisms in your brain that are involved in direct, purposive attention shifting between objects in the world. So you can actually sort of see people shifting between these when we put you in an fMRI. Similarly too with insight. So I'll first cover the moments, or the phenomenological aspects of the aha moment, because as we'll see, each of these aspects is related to the neural systems that are involved in producing these feelings. So this comes from a paper by Topolinsky and Reber. I like this, it's a very good, concise iteration of what is usually found in the insight problem-solving literature. So when you have an insight, it's felt to be true. You are very confident, more confident in your judgments that it's true than if you're just systematically assessing a solution. It's usually felt with positive affect. So you feel kind of happy about it, you feel really good that now you have seen into things and you can solve this problem. It's sudden, so you don't really expect it. It's surprising to the experiencer. And there's a sense of ease. However difficult the problem was before, it's processed fast after you have this shift of perspective. Now, the authors here consider fluency to be the sort of cognitive glue that binds these. Fluency is an ongoing measure of the ease of your processing. So very simple things can affect your fluency. For example, just the text of something that you're reading. If the text is well spaced and you can read it very easily, you're more likely to sort of engage with the material, to take it seriously and to feel good about reading it. Whereas if you sort of make text very difficult to read, then people actually report finding the information itself as being more difficult. So fluency is very important. And later I'm going to mention that I think that it's not fluency per se, which is the cognitive glue resulting in this phenomena of ease and the other things, but rather how this is all related to the flow experience, the experience of being in the zone. All right, so let's go into insight and the brain. How do these reformulations of our problem construals happen? Well, the right temporal lobe here is very important. So that's this area here on right behind your temples. On the right side of the brain, there is a spark of activity that sort of destabilizes the networks that are being maintained across the whole of your brain. And that allows for a spontaneous cascade of neural activity across the brain, and then it sort of snaps back into a state of order. So here we have sort of an interplay between like order and disorder, where you're maintaining one perception that's sort of neurally represented by a set of neural networks that are maintaining your way of seeing this. And in order to initiate the reformulation of that perception, there is a burst of activity on this right temporal lobe. Your brain activity becomes very disordered and scattered across your brain, and then it coalesces back into another state of order which maintains the novel problem formulation. And this has been able to be used to make people solve insight problems, basically. So Chai and Snyder, they've replicated this, they've done this study twice, using transcranial direct stimulation, which is basically taking electrodes and running electrical currents across the brain by stimulating the right anterior temporal lobe to be more disposed to fire, and down-regulating the left anterior temporal lobe to make it less likely to fire, can facilitate the capacity to have these insightful experiences. So they did this experiment on participants using the 9-dot problem, and they actually facilitated the solution of that from 0% to 40%. Which is a massive increase, something that is very rare to find with interventions. You'll see in the control condition, they still had 0 people solve the problem, but with this stimulation condition, 40% of people were able to initiate that insight circuit and to actually solve what is a notoriously difficult problem. So I'm going to ground sort of all of this. I've mentioned the sort of interplay between like chaos and order in the brain. In this sort of framing of the mind, this paper is very good. I think you can find it online for free. So if you're interested in sort of psychedelic studies, this is a great resource. It's called the Entropic Brain, and of course one of the principal authors is Karina Perez, who has himself been doing some brain imaging research out of the Imperial College of London. with psilocybin and LSD. He's got a talk that just happened here in Toronto. You can find that on the Toronto Psychedelic Society's website if you want to get caught up on that. So what they say is that there's basically two different states that, or rather two modes of consciousness. So there's like primary consciousness and secondary consciousness. And what is significant about these is the relative amounts of entropy, which they measure as uncertainty about the state of a system. So high entropy is synonymous with high disorder. Low entropy is synonymous with low disorder, meaning, well, I'll get into what that means in a second. And so in secondary consciousness, entropy suppression is characteristic. So there's a constrained quality of thinking, including metacognitive functions like reality testing and self-awareness. So this is all performed by higher order networks, such as the default mode network. The default mode network has also been referred to as the ego by Robin Carhart Harris. It does the sorts of things we attribute the ego as doing, such as taking yourself as an object, thinking about yourself narratively across time and so on. It's also just active when you're in rest, so it's like your neural self-representation, your tonic resting state that structures your disposition to act in the world in certain ways. And so going into secondary consciousness, or sort of going into primary consciousness, requires the collapse of these normally highly organized networks within at least the default mode network. So for example, in REM, sleep and dreaming, these networks are absent, and in the administration of psychedelic compounds like psilocybin and LSD, they sort of dose-dependently reduce the activity and dominance of this network and allow you to sort of slide into a state very much like dreaming. So in that paper, they propose this as sort of being a general scale, a general framework for this way of thinking. So on the low entropy state, where things are very rigid, very controlled, you have being in a coma. It's not a very active sort of state to be in. Seizures, depression, OCD, addiction. And on the opposite end of the spectrum, you have magical thinking, divergent thinking, dream states, sensory deprivation, mental imagery, psychosis, dreaming. And your consciousness, as you're typically in a waking state, is poised right here where that arrow is. So just above primary consciousness, right above what is called criticality proper here. Now, criticality is an important notion. I won't talk too much about sort of the physics behind that, but what happens at the zone of criticality is that it means that the brain is at a critical point for forming new structures of organization. So in the insight experience being initiated by that right temporal lobe, you're sort of having the brain snap momentarily into primary consciousness to sort of sample information from the environment, and that is maintained within your neural tissue. Perhaps this is where the link to implicit learning comes in, is that your nervous system is sort of sampling a lot more information than you have available to cognitive access. And so what's happening in that insight experience, that problem reformulation, is that it could be sort of pulling information that has been implicitly learned into explicit conscious awareness by sort of sampling the ways in which your neurons have responded to environmental stimulus. So yeah, is that clear, or does anybody have anything to follow up about that? Cool. So on we go. So another important aspect here is cognitive control. So people who are creative tend to have diffuse attention and less cognitive control. That means cognitive control is effectively like being able to determine willfully what you're directing your mind at. People who are creative have very scattered attention. You can be jumping across associations. You might think, oh, look at this table. This table reminds me of this time that I ate something on a table that was similar, and that reminds me of this other time that I was at this restaurant, et cetera, et cetera. So you're sort of cascading across all of these associations. Your attention is very much sort of autonomous in not being directly under cognitive control. However, that does make it easier for the brain to reorganize its construal and representation of the world. The area implicated in cognitive control here, the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex and the medial prefrontal cortex, they're actually, as we will see later, involved in sort of down-regulating what might become a mystical experience. So it sort of suppresses emergent activity to sort of keep you within a given frame. And that allows you, of course, to analytically work on problems as opposed to being distracted all of the time. Now, this is, I think, an interesting link. The visual cortex is also sort of related in this phenomena. And such that it's found that higher resting state visual cortex activity is predictive of the disposition to solve problems with insight as opposed to analysis. So the authors here, Kunios and Beeman, who wrote that book, The Eureka Factor that I mentioned, they took a bunch of people and they put EEG on them, measured their resting state brain activity, and they found that people who had more activity within that visual cortex, just at a resting state, not doing anything at all, that fact was predictive 3 days later of people's capacity to solve problems insightfully. So they left a 3-day gap because they didn't want anything about the experimental context to interfere. And they found that even with that, the data did show a correlation between that resting state visual cortex activity and a disposition for insight. So that sort of ties into vision, comprehension, and time perception, because vision is very deeply related to a lot of other aspects of cognition. For example, we have these two pathways where visual information is processed. The where pathway, which is about determining orientation in space and affording action. So, you know, when you are required to move about or to respond to information in a physical embodied way, your dominance in visual processing is going across that top area, the parietal lobe, which also contains your motor cortex and the formulation of your motor signals. That's also connected up into the frontal cortex area, which we just talked about. So you have sort of that link from the visual cortex across the brain to that cognitive control center, which makes sense because you would want to be able to explicitly control your actions. The other pathway goes across the temporal lobe. That's involved in comprehension. I like to refer to it, at least here, as sort of a comprehension center. It's for determining what is the case. You also have the organ for language comprehension located in here, whereas at the front of the brain, across that where pathway, you have the organ for language production, so ordering language across time, cognitively controlling it. And so what I think is interesting here is that perhaps that visual cortex activity disposition shows sort of more electrical instability that can allow you to sort of fluidly switch between the dominance of these attentional pathways, which becomes significant in how we experience the mystical experience, for example. Timelessness and a breakdown of time and space are considered key aspects of the mystical experience. And the areas of the brain that are involved in time perception and motor timing, in both auditory and visual senses, shares the same cortical structures as the motor area. So your brain is actually reusing the organs involved in the perception of space to perceive time. So if we're getting sort of a shift down to this temporal comprehension pathway in our attention in the experiences of insight, it makes sense that at the level of the mystical experience, we're going to have no capacity to comprehend time or space because we're getting a shift away from the area that's doing that. It's actually basically deactivating that which makes sense of time. All right, so mystical experiences. Here's a few quick definitions that you can find in the literature. They feature subjectively believed encounters with supernatural beings, fusion with a supernatural agent, breakdown in sense of time, space, self, and perception, and hallucinations that might characterize psychiatric disorders. And I like this last one too because it is interesting. You know, it's very difficult to sort of discern when these sorts of experiences are adaptive and when they're maladaptive. And it sort of shows a shared relationship between that which makes us adaptive being responsible for that which makes us maladaptive, which is an idea that you can find sort of all the way back to Plato. He says that people with a nature for philosophy are the most suited to rule, but they can also do the greatest evil. So I like to see these sort of conceptual ideas pop up in this kind of research. Now there's an important distinction between visionary and unitive experiences that I like to make a lot, and what I'm trying to do, especially with this presentation in this project, is to sort of really flesh out what precisely these things are. So I'm going to be talking specifically about the unitive experience, but I like to make it known that there is another category called the visionary experience, which involves engagement with hallucinatory material. You might be visited by an angel or some other sort of entity from outer space. If you read reports on DMT, you'll find all sorts of things like that. People report being in other dimensions. And there's an important quality of being able to sort of engage and interact with those sorts of visions to produce insight. But they are still sort of fundamentally different, and they're doing different things in the brain and therefore have different uses. So the unitive mystical experience, we're going to focus on that. I'll give you a bit of a breakdown of how we're measuring that. This is the developer of the Walter Planck Mystical Experience Questionnaire. I think this is interesting. It plays into the history of psychedelic research as it was developed for the Good Friday experiments, which were used to just discern the occurrence of mystical experiences, giving people either psilocybin or Ritalin in a Good Friday Mass. So they found that. Yeah, you don't need the Mass to have that happen. They found that it definitely helps you to have religious experiences in those settings. And this scale has been confirmed by the Griffiths lab at Johns Hopkins University. They are still using this scale, so it stands up to the test of time. So let's sort of see what things count as the unitive mystical experience. All right, so we have internal unity and external unity. So I've just included some of the sub-items that I think are very relevant. I think to count as having a mystical experience, you need to rate having like 60% of all of the items true. And so you can see within the first item, internal unity, we have specifically mentioned the experience of unity with ultimate reality. So if you're experiencing ultimate reality, also obviously you think that's probably true, and you're confident about the truth of that. So you also have intuitive insights into the inner nature of objects. Well, that's pretty clear. We directly need an insight here. Experiences of oneness, unity with persons or surroundings. We also have transcendence of time and space, loss of time, loss of space. I already talked briefly about why that might be occurring, because we're sort of getting a deactivation of that which makes sense of those things, and a bias towards the centers of your brain which are responsible for comprehension in general. So that's why you're feeling it's like absolute comprehension. It's just the feeling of comprehension itself without the context of these other factors that ground us in so-called external objective reality. So there's also ineffability and paradoxicality. It's very difficult to speak of these experiences in words, which I think is also related to that sort of pathway disposition with our attention. As I mentioned, just below that sort of frontal cortex area involved in cognitive control, we have Broca's area, which is involved in the production of language. So with the biasing of your neural pathways away from this action-oriented pathway, we're also reducing the capacity to be able to use verbal discursive language, but we're still getting an activation of the areas that are involved in comprehending language. So it feels like it has semantic significance, but we can't produce any of that semantic significance. So sense of sacredness, awe, amazement, there we clearly see the elements of positive affect showing up. Noetic quality, there's a gaining of insightful knowledge. Again, we see insight explicitly showing up, and deeply felt positive mood. Well, positive affect has its own category. So just to run through that again, to map on those dimensions that Topolinsky and Reber refer to onto the mystical experience, we have truth and confidence, which we have items 1 and 6 referring to. Here's some other quotes I included from authors that talk about it. Of course, William James here refers to it as the insight into the depths of truth, unplumbed by discursive intellect, contact with ultimate reality, and so on. So positive affect comes up as its own category in 7 and also shows up in category 5. And interestingly, this relationship between positive affect and insight is bidirectional, such that if you just prime people to feel positive moods before an experimental context, they're more likely to have experiences of creativity and insight. So that's interesting. I think that has to do with sort of the information processing parameters that are characteristic of positive affect. You typically have like a greater emotional, or sort of a greater attentional scope and greater access to memory, for example, than you do in negative mood states, which sort of constrict your awareness. And suddenness doesn't really show up clearly on the Walter Pank questionnaire, but you can definitely find it easily elsewhere. As you can see, the subtitle of this book is When Epiphanies and Sudden Insights Transform Ordinary Lives. And I like Kabbalah a lot. It is fascinating, so I like to throw things about that in my presentations every now and then. So it's a tradition of Jewish mysticism. And in this tradition, the mystic is often only able to understand the structure of reality, the so-called tree of life, in a momentary lightning flash. It's non-discursive, non-verbal, and then as soon as your capacity to have verbal, conceptual cognition comes back, the apprehension of that goes away as well. So ease, not clearly on the mystical experience questionnaire either, but like I said before, I think that that's related to flow, which John Vervaeke in a recent publication refers to as an insight cascade. So I'll read you this, but basically, this is the phenomenon just like being in the zone, like performing optimally when your skills are optimally matched to the challenges. You're being sort of pushed to the limits of your ability, and you really are intensely engaged with a task. So elements of that include heightened concentration and attention on the activity at hand, a sense of distorted time, transcendence of self, reduction of reflective awareness, reduced or absent worry over failure, present moment focus, autotelic engagement in the activity. That means you're intrinsically interested in the activity for itself, not for some extrinsic motivation. Someone's telling you to do it. There's a merging of action and awareness and the feeling of being at one with the environment or activity. In other words, a deep sense of at-one-ment with one's surroundings. So this all is the experience of sort of fluidly engaging something that is just at the edge of your capacity to perform it. And so if we link that to these elements here, then we see that in that description we get items from 1, 2, 3, and 7 on the mystical experience questionnaire showing up. You know, senses of oneness, being at one with the environment, being unable to comprehend time, and that sort of deeply felt positive mood. And so, yeah, that experience of flow, basically as it's talked about in the paper that I'm quoting there, it's just a successive sequence of insights occurring one after another. So these are two main hypotheses of mystical experience. We have the temporal involvement hypothesis, which states that emergent activity in the temporal lobe, specifically the right temporal lobe, is involved in initiating a sort of entropic cascade of activity that takes over the brain. It can be caused by temporal lobe epilepsy. So people who have like electrical instability in their temporal lobe and are prone to seizures in that area often experience that as a mystical experience. So Philip K. Dick and Bastedo are people who are very commonly referred to as possibly having this condition, and both frequently had bouts of ecstatic writing after mystical experiences and a whole other interesting array of related experiences. So then we have the executive inhibition hypothesis, which is that the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, which is involved in cognitive control and the inhibition of emergent activity, sort of downregulates the emergent activity that is being initiated by that temporal lobe structure. So what's interesting about that, too, is that there are qualities of that dorsolateral prefrontal cortex which are involved in predicting, for example, the inhibition of religious belief. There's greater activity in that area in skeptics compared to believers of supernatural phenomena. And so the authors, Cristofori et al., they claim that downregulating this area is involved in, or actually, wait, sorry, that's me, I claim that. Downregulating the area is involved in allowing for activation of the insight circuit.